Hey everyone, welcome back to the Michael Lofton Show on Reason and Theology. Really honored to have a very special guest today, Justin Brierley. The man, the myth, and the legend. You've done incredibly great work that I have personally benefited from, and many others have with Premiere, Unbelievable Radio, and many other things that you've done. So, first of all, I have to just say personally, thank you so much, and welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you very much. It's so kind of you to say all that. I guess, yeah, it's been a while that I've been doing what I've been doing, 20 plus years that I've been working in Christian journalism, creating conversations between skeptics and Christians. And yeah, so lovely to meet you and to great to see what your own channel is doing here, Michael.
The honor is all mine. How did you get into Christian radio and journalism and all that?
Well, I grew up in a Christian family, but I guess my own faith was tested to some extent in my teenage and university years as I met skeptical objections to faith. So I kind of discovered apologetics, as we call it, the rational defense of Christian faith in those sort of teenage university years. But I was very drawn towards theatre, arts, that kind of thing. So I knew I wanted to go in a direction in terms of a career
Mhm.
that would bring out that side of my personality. And in the end, I ended up during university doing some work experience for a radio station. Really loved it, really enjoyed that. And in the end, my wife and I got married just after university. We went away on a sort of a gap year after getting married. And when I returned, I was able to begin working for a Christian radio station in the UK. And so that really brought together my love for kind of doing things that are expressive, artistic, but also this interest I had in Christian apologetics, because not long after I began at the station, I started the Unbelievable Show, which
Mm.
was aimed at bringing Christians and non-Christians together for dialogue and debate. And that was just a wonderful way of really engaging the arguments for and against Christianity over a number of years. I learned an awful lot in the process. And yeah, it brought together all the different things I was enthusiastic about.
Yeah, I bet you were able to glean a lot by setting up a lot of those debates and discussions. I've set up a few myself, and every single time I always learn from every side, whether I agree with them or not. And so, um, you've had all sorts of people on. You've had your skeptics like Bart Ehrman and Richard Dawkins and many others that you've had in conversations with. And I suspect you've learned a lot from
Yeah.
those conversations, and that's probably why you decided to write this book, which is what we're talking about today, Why I'm Still Christian. The subtitle is After 2 Decades of Conversations with Skeptics and Atheists, The Reasons I Believe. So I guess all of the groundwork for this book was kind of
Yeah.
prepared and laid from those conversations.
Absolutely. And as I say, I learned an awful lot in the process. And I think what was unique about all of those conversations was because I was having someone on from both sides, both
Mm.
a skeptic and a Christian, it really did make me think through the issues. You weren't just hearing just from one side of the argument. And I guess what I learned in the process was I learned what I thought were the most solid, persuasive arguments for faith. What are some of the most difficult arguments as well to counter? And in the process, it really helped to shape the way I present my faith, both the way I think about it personally, but how I would encourage non-Christians to take the challenge of Christianity seriously. And the book is very much that. It's an encapsulation after 20 plus years now of hosting these conversations, how I would lay out the case for faith to a skeptic, to a curious agnostic. And yeah, each chapter is kind of one particular way in which I think there's either some kind of evidence for God or Christianity, or perhaps encountering a particular objection to faith. But that's not to say that it's I'm the finished article. There are always going to be new questions, and the conversations continue to sort of captivate me in many ways. But certainly this is the kind of book that I suppose you can only write after having those many conversations and thought-provoking discussions.
Yeah, absolutely. And so kind of tell me who the target audience is. Who do you think would benefit most from this? Is this going to be only Christians and then certain kinds of Christians? Do you think it would benefit everyone?
Well, I guess every author wants to say it's for everyone, don't they? But in all honesty, yeah, I think Christians will benefit from this. and I would say Christians of lots of different denominational backgrounds, because I purposefully tried to make this a sort of a mere Christianity, if you will.
Yeah.
So whether you think of yourself as Protestant, Catholic, Reformed, whatever, I think there's going to be something in here that's helpful for you, because we're really getting to the absolutely central creedal beliefs of Christianity and looking at how we can make sense of them and support them. So simply the evidence for God, the evidence for Jesus, the evidence for the resurrection, those kinds of key critical things, and then addressing some of those common objections around suffering and the problem of evil and so on. So I think for Christians, it'll be helpful in giving them a confidence to be able to go and talk about their faith with others who perhaps have questions or don't believe. But I also genuinely hope this is the kind of book that a Christian could give to their non-Christian friend who's got those kinds of questions themselves, because I did very much write it with that person in mind as well, so that someone who's reading this who isn't a Christian won't be put off by any kind of preachy language or jargon or anything like that. I'm hoping it'll be the kind of book which a non-Christian could easily pick up and feel like, yeah, this helps me to think through some of the issues.
So not only the Christian who already has, belief, but also the skeptic who may need some reasons to believe. So both would benefit.
Absolutely, both of them. Yeah.
That's awesome. You talk about in the book about sharing your faith with others. Obviously, you've had the opportunity to do that in many of these cases, so that probably comes natural to you at this point. But there's a lot of people who might be hesitant to do so. They feel a little uncomfortable, especially if they're, face to face or in the workplace or with family and friends. It can be a little jarring. So what are some tips that you learned on how to make that a little bit easier?
It is always daunting to share our faith with others, especially if we feel like, that's not something I'm good at. I haven't had 20 years experience hosting conversations. So we're all starting in different places. But I would say there are some simple things that everyone, whatever their level of experience, can hold on to. And that is that part of it is actually about listening, not just speaking. I think the most successful kinds of conversations where the other person genuinely feels listened to are the most successful kind of conversations. So it's not that you have to go in with all the answers. You just, I think, often have to be open to hearing and listening. And there will become a time for response. But unless someone genuinely feels like they've been heard, then, however you respond won't land much if they don't feel like, they've been genuinely listened to. So I'd say that's a really key thing, to make sure that you listen to the person opposite you. The second thing is that it's okay in conversations to say, I don't know. It's important that we don't try to make out that we know more than we do. We'll quickly come unstuck, I think, if we try to pretend to know things that we don't. So generally in general conversations with people, I think it's fine for you to say, if you're not sure of something or you don't have an answer, well, I don't actually know the answer to that, but could give me a chance to go away, look into it, and let's come back and continue the conversation. I'd say it's always good to keep the door open to more conversation, rather than sort of trying to assume that every conversation you have to sort of somehow close the deal or have won an argument or whatever. And I think generally that's true of our conversations in general. The problem is that social media and some of these kind of debate video shows and things, they tend to set it up as very combative and adversarial, where there has to be a winner and a loser. But that's not the way conversations normally happen in real life. I think it's fine for you to sort of not necessarily come out with sort of, I have convinced this person, as long as you've given your perspective, you've been able to sort of hopefully share some of the reasons for your faith, even if you didn't maybe have answers to everything that someone asked. I think that's perfectly good. And as long as you, as I said, keep that door open to future conversations, you never know where that could lead you. I often think skeptics and people with questions, agnostics, are far more respectful. Actually, they've got a lot more respect for someone who they kind of admits their own limitations than for someone who claims to be some $1 million apologist who can, answer every argument. So those are all just tips to say, take the pressure off yourself a bit. This isn't like, it's not like every conversation has to have some specific outcome. I think what's important though is that when you do receive questions that you're not sure about, then do take the time to go and investigate and try to as I say, come up with some, hopefully find some wisdom, some answers that you can then take back into the conversation. And that's exactly what 1 Peter 3:15 admonishes us to do always be ready to give an answer to anyone who asks you about the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect. And I think that gentleness and respect part of the conversation is super important. Don't kind of fall into the trap of kind of answering someone who's kind of angry or dismissive with anger and dismissiveness. Just try to constantly model that grace, because ultimately I think that speaks volumes, as well as the things we can
It
say.
does, but it can be so hard to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
You know, I look back on myself from years ago. I kind of took that approach where I thought you got to close the deal immediately
Hmm.
because this person might die and go to hell,
Mm,
and so there was all that pressure. But in reality, with experience, you begin to learn that's just not the way people work. Most people
mm.
don't come away convinced after one conversation. I don't know. Maybe you can say from your experience that that has happened in some cases, but I suspect it's rare if it has.
It's very rare, I'd say. Most people are, to use the parlance, on a journey, aren't they? And often your conversations are just one among a whole series of things going on in their lives that are either pulling them towards or even, sending them away from faith. And so in the end, all we can do is try to be faithful with the opportunities we've been given. But let's not, put ourselves under this immense pressure that somehow it's all down to us. In the end, I really don't believe it is down to us. It's a
Yeah.
work of the Spirit. It's often just as much about the emotional and psychological and spiritual issues going on with someone as it is about the intellectual issues that they may present with on the surface. So don't imagine that it's all down to your one conversation. But having said all that, there are, God often, I have seen God use conversations and intellectual conversations and discussions to sort of help to remove some of the roadblocks for some people, and where perhaps one particular conversation was very significant in helping them to overcome some kind of barrier to faith. But as I say, it's very rarely just one conversation. There's often a whole set of things that have gone into the process where someone does eventually put their trust in Christ. It's a long old process usually.
Yeah, I've seen that in my own life. Anytime I've modified my own thinking or beliefs, it's been because not because of necessarily one conversation, but a series of conversations with a number of people. I will definitely say that there are some conversations that stick out, and there were some
Mm,
seeds that were planted. Maybe somebody made a particular point that
mm,
stuck with me for years
yeah,
and really ended up, it didn't impact me immediately, but it stuck with me. And maybe 10 years later, then it began to grow.
yeah.
So you never know, the conversations that you have with people. It might not necessarily be that you immediately change their mind, but it could be that you plant some kind of seed that
Yeah.
later on will be used.
I like the way that Greg Kokel has put it. He's often talked about putting a stone in someone's shoe. It's just something that niggles away often, and it's not necessarily the deal breaker for them, but it's something that maybe stays there in the back of their mind long enough for them to perhaps, when the next conversation comes around, maybe with someone else, that was an important little bit of their thinking that was jiggled in order to make them open to the next thing.
So talking a little bit more here about the book, one thing that I really wanted to get to is demonstrating the possibility that we can prove God exists, especially for a skeptic. What have you learned over the years on how to do that?
Yeah. Well, in Why I'm Still a Christian, one of the things I say kind of up front is that proofs per se are very difficult to get. You don't really, in most fields, most subjects, ever have what you might call a mathematical proof of something. All you have in most cases are the kind of a theory that is the best explanation for something. And
Yeah.
that's most of what science is, to be honest. Even most scientific theories are provisional. They're kind of the best explanation we currently have for this phenomena, for this set of evidence we have. In historical studies, in all kinds of other areas, we're looking for the best explanations we have. Proof per se is a difficult thing to sort of say it's 100% certain that this is the case. So I think you just have to be a little bit humble and modest and say we're not necessarily setting out to prove that God exists when it comes to conversations with skeptical friends. But what we are, I think, hoping to do is to show that God is a very reasonable explanation.
Mhm.
That when you look at the options that are on offer, God and Christianity in particular are probably actually the best explanation when you look at it compared to the other options. And this was sort of something I learned kind of early on in the course of hosting these conversations between Christians and atheists. Was I think I possibly entered that initially thinking, well, all of the burden of proof is on me as a Christian to show that Christianity is true. And my atheist friend may be sitting there saying, well, I'm the one who doesn't have any beliefs, Justin. You're the one with all the strange beliefs about God and angels and the supernatural. So you have to convince me. And I soon realized actually that's simply not true. We all come to life with a worldview, a perspective on life, if you like. And yes, I may be a Christian, I may believe in God, I may believe that that has all kinds of ramifications for the way life is. But my atheist friend, more than likely than not, also has a worldview. So most of the people who came on my show, it turned out, were naturalists. That is, people who believe that all that ultimately exists is the forces of nature and the physical stuff of the universe. Okay, now that's not a kind of a neutral position starting point. That's a very specific belief system. There's all kinds of things that come out of that. It means that ultimately there is no overarching purpose or story to the universe. It kind of came from nowhere. It's heading nowhere. There's no sort of overarching meaning to things. If all that ultimately exists is matter in motion, that's a very specific way of looking at the universe. And there's all kinds of things that come out of that I'm going to have questions for my atheist friend about, just as much as they may have questions about my worldview. So I think it's important, first of all, to realize we're looking at two different worldviews most of the time, and we're going to have questions for each other. So make sure that we don't imagine that it's all down to us and so on. And once you do that, once you look at, for instance, and this is the sort of the two options I look at in detail in the book, when you look at atheist naturalism and you look at Christianity, what you're asking is, well, which provides the best explanation of the evidence and data that's available to all of us? Okay. And when I start to look at various aspects of our universe, about our personal moral intuitions, about history, about lots of things, I realized actually there's all kinds of ways in which the evidence seems to support the view that there is a God and that God has been revealed to us in Jesus. And while it's not that that's 100% the case, there's going to be evidence on the other side as well against that. Overall, I found that you can make a very compelling case that, yeah, God is the best explanation, a better explanation certainly than atheism for a lot of the data that's available to us. So that's kind of where I start out in the book, trying to make clear that we're looking for the best explanation. And in my view, when you go looking, it turns out God is a really good explanation.
What have you concluded are maybe the top 3 reasons to believe that God exists? What are those best explanations?
Well, there's a kind of 3 useful ways in which I kind of specifically lay out in 3 chapters, 3 reasons why God is the best explanation. The first is that I think God makes best sense of human existence. Secondly, that God makes best sense of human value. And thirdly, that God makes best sense of human purpose. So obviously the common factor in all these is the human, but the human existence piece is because when you actually look at what it took for humans to exist in the cosmos, it turns out there are all kinds of interesting things that we've found out about or that have come to our attention that mean that the idea that we are just a kind of fluke result, if you like, of biological and natural processes doesn't seem to stack up with what the evidence is actually telling us. So in that particular chapter, I look at things like the fine-tuning of the universe for life, this extraordinary phenomenon in which it looks as though the universe saw us coming because its fundamental numbers and laws are dialed so precisely to the positions they need to be in order for chemistry, atoms, stars, galaxies, and ultimately humans to be able to exist. This fine-tuning of the universe is just the most phenomenal aspect of what cosmology has discovered, and just how unlikely it seems that we are just the outworking of just sort of random processes, if you like. Then you've got, the fact there is a universe, the Big Bang cosmology that, again, many people may be familiar with, but the fact that the universe had a beginning in time and space about 14 billion years ago. Again, obviously we go through this in much more detail in the chapter, but sure. There is something about that seems to, as far as I can see, fit better with the theistic view. It doesn't seem to cohere nearly as well with the view that there is no ultimate sort of design or purpose to the universe and indeed to our place within it. And you just got the fact you can do science, frankly, you know, the fact that the universe is explicable and can be mapped by the human brain using the language of mathematics. Again, as the prize-winning physicist Eugene Wigner said, this is a kind of a miracle that we neither expected nor can explain, you know, on a purely atheistic worldview. There's so many things that seem to cohere about our existence in the universe with the view that there is some kind of design going on behind it. So in lots of different ways, I think you can say human existence fits better with the fact that we live in a universe with a God behind it. Then I turn sort of from looking out there at the stars to looking within with human value. And I say, well, why do we believe in things like human rights? Why do we enshrine these rights in things like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Where do we get that idea that humans have this intrinsic worth, value, and dignity? Because again, that's not something that's readily explainable on a purely atheistic view of the world, where we are essentially just one more byproduct of the tree of life. There's no particular reason why we should prefer our species over any other species in the big scheme of things. And yet, you know, most people, most atheists that I've met, vigorously hold on to the idea that humans do have this intrinsic worth, equality, dignity. And again, I find it very hard to ground that on a purely atheistic view of the world, where all that ultimately exists is matter and motion. It seems to me that if you want to have this idea of the intrinsic worth, value, and dignity of every human being, you have to kind of look beyond just the natural world to a transcendent realm of moral laws. And that, I think fits better with the Christian view of reality than an atheist one, where in the end our morality is kind of just whatever works, essentially, to kind of get DNA propagating itself. But that's not the way we actually think about morality. Morality is something that's, when people actually encounter it for what it is, it's something that impresses itself upon you as what you ought to do, not just whatever is best for the sort of flourishing of human DNA. So again, that's a very brief overview of a much bigger subject, but that human value, again, I think points towards God. And finally, human purpose, just very briefly, this is the idea that, you know, why are we here? What's the purpose of life? Again, Christianity tells a story about who you are and why you're here that I think is very powerful, that actually motivates people to live lives in all kinds of helpful, fruitful ways. The problem is that atheism just doesn't have a story for that. The only story it has, in a sense, is that all purposes and you know, self-made plans will one day be extinguished in the heat death of the universe. You know, that's the kind of physical story of reality, but it's not a story that really appeals to most people. Most people have this sense that no, life is about more than that. We're here for something. And again, I would just simply say that this is an aspect of our human experience that, again, points in the direction of God rather than away from God. So very briefly, those are my three key areas: human existence, human value, and human purpose. For me, all fit better with God, with Christianity, than with this naturalist, atheist view of looking at the world.
A lot of great points there, and I appreciate you mentioned the fine-tuning argument. I do think it's very compelling. What I've seen people who are skeptics try to say in response to that is, okay, yeah, in this universe you have that, but that's because there's an infinite amount of multiverses where the numbers are ran and you may or may not get the fine-tuning. And so, yeah, you would expect yourself as a conscious being to be in the one universe where everything makes sense and it's fine-tuned and all that. But so then they're positing this multiverse, and to my knowledge, I don't think there's any objective evidence for it, and I just think it's ironic because it sounds like there's more evidence for God than there is this multiverse notion.
It's a whole fascinating area, and we get into the weeds of that in the book. Now, you know, okay, let's do this. This is kind of where the geek in me comes out, I'm afraid, because this multiverse thing is fascinating, and it's a bit like you know, I in the book I liken something like the force of gravity, for instance, taking the very specific value it has. If it differed by that value in 1 part in 10 to the 60 approximately, then human life couldn't exist, basically. So if it was just ever so slightly stronger, ever so slightly weaker, you know, matter wouldn't be able to coalesce or else it would be flung out too far for anything to develop. So this, and I had a mathematician friend work out for me, what's the equivalent of 1 in 10 to the 60 when it comes to like how many times you roll a dice and get the number 6. And basically, if you rolled a number 6 70 times in a row with a dice, that's about the odds of the force of gravity being just right, because it's about 1 in 10 to the 60. Okay.
Wow.
And so I got him to work out how long would you have to kind of stand there rolling this dice for before you got kind of 76s in a row. And he worked out it was something like 100 trillion, like just longer than the universe has been in existence. That's the point. So it's kind of it reinforces the fact that, the numbers aren't going to come out by chance. It's just not possible. Okay. That's just not on the table. So what the multiverse proposes is, well, what if you had a literally endless number of times to roll the dice? What if you could basically what if there was an endless set of universes, each with their own different roll of the dice? And in one of them, and in a sense, in maybe many of them, if you've got an infinite number, you do get the right dice number. You do get that force of gravity right. And you do get all the other bits just right. And we happen to be in one of those universes. So it turns out that kind of it is down to chance after all. It's just that we got lucky. We happen to be in one of the universes where the dice was rolled just right. Okay, so that's interesting. But as you say, the problem is there evidence for this? Have we got actually any? Now, it's interesting because on one level, scientists themselves are split on multiverse theory. Some scientists say it's just not a scientific theory because in principle, we couldn't empirically test for it, because by definition, universes are kind of separate to each other. So there's no way we could detect the presence of any of these other multiverse. So some scientists just say it's not a theory, it's not a scientific theory, it's a kind of hypothesis, but not a scientific one. Others have, using something that's called the inflationary theory of the universe, they've hypothesized that there could be kind of bubble universes that kind of popped off essentially the inflationary period of our own universe. And in the sense, our universe is just one of these many bubble universes. Again, it's not that that's not a scientific hypothesis. It's just that it's impossible to know how you would test that. It is a hypothesis that, frankly, I think will just remain a hypothesis, because there's really no way of kind of. So it's not that there's no thinking. It's not. I don't want to accuse those who suggest a multiverse hypothesis of just doing it to escape the challenge, if you like, of the fine tuning, because it's not. It's because, but I still think you've got to ask yourself, well, how would you really know? But there are other things which also, make it actually quite unlikely that there's a multiverse. So there are just some philosophical things that are worth bearing in mind. The first thing is that even if you do propose a multiverse hypothesis, those hypotheses that have been suggested require themselves vast amounts of fine tuning. So you don't lose the problem is the problem. It just knocks it back one stage to the multiverse stage. So you still got an extraordinary amount of fine tuning to take into account. So you're not really solving the problem of fine tuning by invoking a multiverse.
That's a good point.
So the multiverse hypothesis itself requires an extraordinary amount of fine tuning. But when you look at ourselves, so you and I, we are both, as far as we can tell, conscious beings in a highly ordered world, in a highly ordered cosmos, okay, that was able to produce you and I. Now, the problem is that at a philosophical level, that is a very, very, very unlikely one of these universes that could produce a kind of self-reflecting being. Okay, it's far, 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 far more likely on balance that the thing that would be produced in one of these many multiverses is a kind of what's called a Boltzmann brain, a brain that just pops into existence, observes itself for a while, and then pops back out of existence. So just a patch of order in an otherwise very disorderly universe. Those are, like, by order of magnitudes, far more likely to come into being than the universe we actually find ourselves in, which is this incredibly ordered universe in which we have multiple minds and we're able to have conversations like this and so on. So that alone should make you question whether we live in a multiverse, because the fact the universe we find ourselves in is one of the most least likely universes that could produce a kind of self-reflecting life. And so a lot of people have said that alone suggests that the multiverse theory is not true because we are not Boltzmann brains, and it's far more likely that we would find ourselves in a Boltzmann brain situation than the one we do. So those are just some of the reasons why people are skeptical of multiverse theory. I don't rule it out, but I don't think it solves the problem either, even if there was a multiverse.
That's much more sophisticated than my own refutation of the multiverse theory that I thought of, I guess, a few years ago. And that is, well, if the multiverse theory is true, right, you would have, at least in some universe, a group of people who have created the technology to communicate to everyone in every other universe, and they would let us know if the multiverse is true or not. And so far, we haven't been contacted by such beings.
Well, that is a fascinating. I mean, there's all kinds of weird implications of multiverse theory. Like, there is a universe in which Richard Dawkins is the Pope, right? There's I mean, everything that is possible will happen in a kind of infinite set of universes. So, in a weird way, when atheists bring up the multiverse theory as an objection to kind of God and Christianity, I kind of like to tease them sometimes and say, well, if it's true, if multiverse theory is true, there is actually a universe in which Christianity is completely true, where someone called Jesus walked on water, did all the miracles. Everything that can happen will happen. So Christianity is actually true in a multiverse universe. So it's got all these kind of weird implications for it that actually kind of might actually make the average atheist uncomfortable, because, hey, maybe we are in that universe where Christianity is true, if that's true.
Yeah,
anyway,
there's some
fun
universe.
to think about that.
There's some universe where they're the Christian and you're the atheist, and they're trying to convince you.
It's mind-boggling, isn't it?
So we're talking here about science and faith, and of course, a lot of people think that they just do not go hand in hand. But you've got a lot of experience here in these conversations. What have you been able to glean that determines actually science points towards God, not away from God?
Yeah, well, I would say what we've just been talking about, the fine-tuning of the universe, Big Bang cosmology, the fact we can do science, all of these are pointers towards God rather than away from God. The key areas where the atheists, especially the new atheists, Dawkins, Harris, Hitchens and co., where they tended to use science as a sort of battering ram against faith, was the idea that, well, science gives us objective reason, and faith is just about kind of wishing things were true or accepting things on dogma and so on. And of course, to some extent, that can be true. There can be people who act like that when it comes to faith. But of course, you and I, I imagine, are of the same mind here, that actually faith, when best expressed, is actually about taking reason, but not sort of using it, at the expense of the other ways in which we can know things through experience, revelation, and everything else. But that we actually bring all these things together. And the interesting thing about science itself is that it was, from its inception in the scientific revolution, a very Christian project. All of the pioneers of the scientific revolution were believers themselves. And the reason they went and did their science was precisely because they did believe in God. It was precisely because they went out expecting to find a universe that obeyed natural laws, that had kind of, if you like, been set up to be explored. And this wasn't something that, it wasn't sort of accidental that happened within the Christian framework. There were lots of other opportunities historically when the scientific revolution could have got going, but it didn't in many other civilizations and epochs of history. And that's because, the historians will tell you, it's because they did not have a worldview which kind of led them to expect this order in nature. And so there's a very convincing case to be made that the modern scientists who kind of decry religion, they actually owe their livelihood to the Christians who started the scientific revolution in the first place. So there was never this kind of sort of conflict between God and faith in those early years of the scientific revolution. And to be honest, most of the most famous scientific pioneers were devout Christians and often clergymen. Even up to the 20th century, Georges Lemaitre, who was one of the pioneers of Big Bang theory, was a Catholic priest. So there's never historically really been this divide until the new atheists came along and started banging this drum that religion and faith and science are in conflict with each other. A lot of that sort of story is based on retellings of the Galileo trial, and and the idea that Darwin was set against the church with the theory of evolution and everything else. A lot of these, if you actually go back and look at what actually happened, they're not nearly as clear cut as some of these atheist sort of polemicists like to make out. And what you'll find is that there's always been a lively dialogue between science and faith, but that it's never been as though faith kind of squashes science and sort of refuses to accept the results of science. It's just that actually things are more complicated when you actually go back historically. So that, there's a lot to be said, much more to be said there, but essentially the idea that science has buried God is just a very naive idea that was peddled by a lot of new atheists, but simply isn't the case. And it turns out the more we know about the universe, the more it looks like there's some kind of guiding hand, there's some kind of transcendent purpose at the very least that exists there. And the more I talk to scientists, the more they've kind of even non-believing scientists, that I've often found them to be kind of quite upset at the way science has been sort of co-opted for this atheistic agenda, because they don't think that's the direction it points in necessarily at all.
The book is titled Why I'm Still a Christian. And so far what we've pointed to is just evidence for this generic God. So the title of the book isn't Why I'm Still a Theist. It's specifically Christian. How do we get then from this generic God to the Christian God?
Then that's a really good question, because in the end, I am a Christian. And yes, while it's good, there are lots of the things I've just been saying that could be used in as a justification for Islam and other forms of theism.
Right.
The question is, has this God revealed himself to us in a particular way? And in my view, yes, God has, in the person of Jesus Christ. And Jesus is inevitably the defining part of Christianity and the thing that sets Christianity apart from all the other religious worldviews. And for me, what that means is that we kind of, having had that sort of, if you like, general revelation through science and the natural world about God, we then have this specific revelation in a person, and through, inevitably a set of historical documents in the Old and New Testaments that tell us actually who this God is. And so where this sort of, for me, comes down into its kind of most sharp point is in the death and resurrection of Jesus. If you like, that's, if someone was to ask me, well, why you a Christian rather than a Buddhist or a Muslim or Jewish, I would say, well, it's because of Jesus, and it's because of his life, his death, and his resurrection. Because if it's true that Jesus was who he claimed to be in the Gospels, and if he died and was resurrected in vindication of those claims, then you have to take this very seriously. This isn't just my opinion versus your opinion. We're talking about a set of historical, claims, and that God got involved and showed who he was in the person of Jesus. So there's two chapters which really delve into that whole thing, the life, the evidence for Jesus just generally, and also specifically the evidence for his resurrection.
What do you think demonstrates that the resurrection is true? From all of the arguments that you've heard over the years, what's the most convincing evidence for the resurrection?
I mean, this inevitably depends on what you mean by the evidence, because I'm tempted to immediately just go to the historical data. Okay, we will get there in a moment. But what I would want to say is that there are plenty of people who accept the resurrection of Jesus in ways that I think are perfectly acceptable, rationally acceptable, but who have never appealed to the historical data or anything else. It's because they've experienced something within themselves that affirms the truth of the resurrection. They've experienced, in a sense, resurrection themselves. And that's enough for them. It's kind of, that's that. Now, obviously, the problem with that is it's harder to show someone else, because that's a very subjective experience. But nonetheless, I don't want to discount the kind of the validity of someone's personal experience, that they've had an experience essentially of the Holy Spirit that has convinced them that Jesus is alive because of the impact it's had on their life. However, I think what can be really helpful, especially for skeptics who haven't necessarily had that experience, is to say, well, there is actually some really interesting historical data that you kind of have to take seriously when it comes to the resurrection, because Christianity came from somewhere. It didn't just pop up, out of nowhere.
Mhm.
Something happened that led a whole lot of people to start claiming that someone called Jesus of Nazareth had died and been raised to life again. And the question is, was that just them having a mass hallucination? Was it just them making something up for political gain? No, I think when you actually go and look at the historical data, you quickly find that there are some really key things that stick out. And not everyone's a fan of this, but I like this approach. Michael Licona and Gary Habermas are two New Testament scholars who together kind of developed what's sometimes called the minimal facts approach to the resurrection. And that's kind of just trying to boil down to 4 or 5 key pieces of evidence, which are kind of historical facts, which are agreed upon by the vast majority of New Testament scholars, not just believing ones, but simply ancient historians of that era who could say, yeah, that is a kind of, that's the consensus view on that. Okay. And what's helpful about this approach is it kind of takes you out of the realm of, oh, you've got to believe the Bible is inspired, you've got to believe in Jesus, you've got to It's just saying, no, if we just treat these things as historical documents and just ask the people whose job it is to know basically what we can agree on, the vast majority of them, whether they're Christians or not, agree on these 4 or 5 historical facts. So the 5 I mention in the book are, firstly, Jesus died by crucifixion. That's a very uncontroversial, uncontested fact of ancient history. It's one of the best attested facts, in fact, of ancient history. The second one is that a group of his female followers discovered the empty tomb. And again, that's a really interesting one, because the fact that the majority of scholars agree on that is not necessarily because they believe he rose again, but simply because when you look at it, there is good historical sort of credence for that fact, partly because the New Testament writers wouldn't have had any kind of reason to invent that fact. The fact that women specifically were the discoverers of the empty tomb in a culture where a woman's testimony is worth far less than that of a man, it would be very odd for them to invent that kind of a detail in the gospel stories had it not actually happened. And so via something that's sometimes called the criterion of embarrassment in historical studies, we know that seems to be a very likely true story, that women discovered this empty tomb. Thirdly, people reported meeting the risen Jesus. Again, this is agreed upon by the majority of New Testament scholars. Go and ask Bart Ehrman. He will say, yeah, people certainly had experiences of the risen Jesus. Now, he might have a different view to you on what those actually constituted, but he does take that as an established historical fact, just because the weight of the evidence is there from the data, the sources we've got. Fourth, the conversion of skeptics. These would be people like Paul, James, the brother of Jesus. Again, this is sort of uncontested historical facts that skeptics were persuaded of the truth of Christianity in the early years of the church. And again, that's another fact we're just going to put in our arsenal of facts. And fifth, the explosive growth of the Christian church, the fact that this went from being a group of dejected, sort of crushed disciples who had just lost their leader to a brutal Roman execution, to suddenly this group of very brave, confident people willing to be persecuted and even lose their life, and the way in which that movement just ballooned from the first century onwards. And it feels again like there's something at the center of that needs explaining. So when you put all these 5 facts together, you're then asking again the same question we asked earlier: what is the best explanation? And in my view, if you haven't ruled out of court the idea of the miraculous, if you haven't got some other reason to believe that miracles could never happen, then I think you should be open to the possibility that what the first followers said is actually the explanation, that Jesus had risen from the dead. Because if you try to kind of run other possible explanations for these facts, none of them seem to bring them together in the way that the resurrection hypothesis does. So, you've had people saying, well, maybe the body got stolen, maybe they were mistaken, maybe it was a legendary thing that caught on over time, maybe they were all hallucinating. But the problem is, when you kind of run all of these through those 5 facts, it doesn't make sense of all of them. It's a bit more of an ad hoc kind of explanation that doesn't take into account. So I found that quite a powerful way of saying, look, if you're open to the possibility of the miraculous, you should take seriously the claim that the first followers gave, that Jesus was risen from the dead, because it does make good sense of this historical data, which, as I say, is agreed upon by the majority of both Christian and non-Christian historians. There's a lot more that could be said on the back of that,
Sure,
but that's
of
the
course.
kind of starting place, you know.
Well, yeah, yeah, so much more can be said, and you've seen those conversations play out. Have you ever seen a case where a skeptic kind of moved closer to faith from those conversations?
Oh, many, many times. And that's been one of the joys of hosting these conversations is, although very often, you know, you're not necessarily expecting the skeptic within the conversation to move, because they're kind of just coming in for an hour to do a conversation, a debate where they've obviously got their position and they're going to sort of defend it against the other. I've seen many, many skeptics who are listeners of those conversations move, because they've heard things, they've processed things in different ways, and it's led them, you know, on a journey to faith in many cases. Someone I work very closely now with, called Peter Byram, began, you know, our friendship began when he started listening to Unbelievable probably 15 years ago.
Mm,
And he started as an agnostic atheist, you know, someone who, you know, was pretty sure none of this was true, but he'd had his attention piqued at university by the fact that one of his friends there had become a Christian. And he started to read, you know, the sort of the evidence for and against Christianity, ended up engaging with the Unbelievable show. And for many years was there as a really interested observer, you know, who I was in touch with by email, even came on the show at one point as an agnostic. It was eventually, though, sort of, I think that the growing amount of evidence that he felt he was dealing with led him to the point where he decided, you know what, I think there's enough here for me to intellectually accept that Christianity is true. And then he had to kind of go on a personal journey of, well, what does this mean for my life? If I've kind of become convinced that there's really is something to this, it's going to require a personal change, you know, an embrace of this. And he ended up being quite involved, funnily enough, in a tour I arranged back in 2011 with the Christian philosopher William Lane Craig. And Craig had come over to the UK to do a series of lectures and debates. And Peter, my friend, still an agnostic at this point, was helping us with some of the logistics, some of the video stuff around that. And it was actually during that tour that he became a Christian. And it was partly actually through a helpful conversation he had one night over dinner with Bill and his wife, Jan, in which Jan, funnily enough, said to him, look, don't become a Christian unless you're really sure, Peter, because this isn't an invitation to an easy life. Probably your life's going to become harder. Okay.
yeah.
And he really felt the challenge of that. And it really kind of woke him up to the fact this matters, you know. I can't sort of sit on the sidelines forever here. And that was it. He thought, no, I'm putting my weight on this. I'm going to step into this. And he's been a Christian ever since. So so it's that's just one among many stories I could have reached for, but you know, none of these stories are kind of smooth, kind of straight lines to, you know, they take all kinds of twists and turns. But there's been so many cases, as I say, where a particular conversation or just the weight of a number of conversations have helped to move someone in the direction of being able to take that personal step, which ultimately, you know, Christian faith always is about embracing this at a personal level, not just at a sort of objective intellectual level.
And your friend Peter, for him to embrace it at that personal level instead of just objectively, it was that realization that I just can't be on the fence forever. I mean, you come to a point where you realize you have to be able to live. This has to practically impact your life, and you can't just constantly be in this state of, I'm not sure, I'm still looking into this. Let me check this argument. Let me check that argument. At some point, you got to have to make some kind of practical decision and say, okay, either I believe or I don't. And it sounds like your friend kind of got to that point. And
I think so. And I think this is the thing, you know, it's important for many people to spend some time prodding at Christianity from the outside. I fully accept that. But there's also a degree to which you can actually only understand Christianity by actually entering in. You'll never fully, I think, understand what faith is, who God is, who Jesus is, if you're constantly on the outside. And that's where I think the step of faith, you know, that Kierkegaardian sort of leap of faith is. It's not an irrational leap, in as much as, you know, Peter had enough evidence to persuade him that this was true, but he didn't have like I say, you're never going to have a proof. You're never going to have like 100% certainty of anything in life. But he had enough to make him realize, look, I think this is probably true. But you're only really going to experience what that means if you actually step in to the Christian story. And it's only once you're in the Christian story that a lot of things actually end up making more sense, in my opinion. It's only kind of once you've kind of embraced it. So that's where faith kind of comes in. It's kind of almost like putting your weight on something and seeing if it holds up. And for me, that's what a step of faith is. It's not like a step into the abyss, like, oh my goodness, I'm just sort of throwing away all reason and rationality by stepping into this. It's accepting that, no, I've got a certain amount of evidence here, but I still have to do something. And it's at that point that you're kind of putting your weight on the possibility that this is true and seeing how it works out. You know, and that can be a scary thing for anyone, because especially when it comes to Christianity, as it did for Peter, there were all kinds of aspects of his life that he knew, if this is true, if I'm going to accept this and live into this, things are going to have to change in my life. And that was, yeah. So, you know, and in my worst moments, I wonder whether sometimes some of the atheists I meet are forever holding Christianity at arm's length, partially because of that challenge, because they know, well, if I did accept this,
maybe the moral obligations that come along with it and stuff like that. You know, I know we're up against the clock, and I have just a couple questions for you here. So on the flip side, you know, seeing people kind of move closer to faith, I'm not asking, have you moved away from faith by these conversations, but were there moments where you you know, heard arguments from the skeptics that you just think, maybe to this day, man, that's a really good argument, and I just don't know yet how to respond to that?
All the time. Yeah. And I don't want to make out that this is some triumphalist, everyone who listens to my conversations became a Christian. Lots of people never moved. Some people became Christians, you know, as I say, not just through the show, but through lots of things. But there were other people who got in touch, you know, after hearing maybe the same conversation that persuaded someone to take a step of faith, saying, you know what, that convinced me that my move away from Christianity is valid. So you can never tell exactly how someone's going to be impacted, even by the very same conversation. And I kind of had to learn in the end that I just had to kind of leave it in God's hands in a way. I couldn't force how someone was going to respond, either positively or negatively, when it came to faith and these conversations. All I could do was try to, you know, put the issues out there, have the best people on both sides, and kind of let the audience make up their mind. And to some extent, I think it's just the fact that a lot of people, they're usually either moving towards faith or away from faith. And very often what they hear and the way they process the conversations will tend to kind of confirm that movement towards or away in many instances. And that's just a fact of kind of human nature and the biases we have. I will say for myself, absolutely, I frequently have run into questions, people who have made me have to really think my faith through, who have caused sleepless nights sometimes. You know, when I began these conversations 20 plus years ago, I hadn't even thought about a lot of the issues that we ended up debating and discussing. You know, I gave myself lots of reasons to doubt and to kind of, you know, because there were kind of objections I hadn't even realized existed that I ended up, you know, hosting debates about. I suppose what I would say at the end of all of it, though, is that it's not that there aren't any mysteries, objections, things that I still file in that I don't know what to do with that box. It's just that I find that on balance, Christianity still makes more sense of more stuff than the stuff that I still don't necessarily have an answer for. And like you were saying earlier, you kind of have to make a choice in the end. You have to sort of, you can't sit on the fence forever.
Right.
Life is about living. And to that extent, very often I'm trusting in the God I do know for the things that I don't know a lot of the time when I'm a Christian. You just have to, that's what faith is. And the same would be true if I was an atheist. There'd be lots of things that would probably challenge my atheism at various points. And I'd just have to say, well, look, I'm just going to commit to my atheism, because so we're all kind of, you know, we're all doing the faith thing at some level.
Mm.
So that's the way I'd put it. And I hope that I'm always open to having my mind changed. I want to feel at least that I'm an open-minded kind of individual. But at the same time, as I say, once you've kind of embraced Christian faith, you have to some extent. I find it, there's lots that I find very hard to deny now, at this point in my journey. So yeah, always open to the questions, fully aware that I haven't got it all sorted out, but kind of the journey of faith is, as I say, living with the tension there, knowing that actually there's still an awful lot that Christianity does make sense of.
Would you say that's the main takeaway from the book, Why I'm Still a Christian, or is there another thing that you ultimately want people to glean and take away from the book?
I mean, the main thing I want people to take away from this is a sense of confidence, actually, that actually Christianity can stand on its own 2 feet intellectually. As I've been saying, that doesn't mean we have answers to everything, but actually it's worth realizing that Christianity isn't only something people accept because it gives them the feels, the emotional and spiritual and psychological kind of value. It's also a faith you have to take seriously because it's actually got a long history of credible historical, scientific, philosophical thinkers who really looked into this. And there's a whole lot of stuff that's happened before you and I ever came on the scene that needs to be taken into account. And so I would just simply say, the takeaway is you can be a Christian, basically. There are good reasons to be a Christian. And my hope is simply that people will be encouraged with those reasons, whether they're a Christian or not. And just, it might just be that next step they need on a journey of faith, or even, encountering God for the first time themselves.
I want to recommend everybody go and get a copy. There's a link to it in the show notes. Why I'm Still a Christian, subtitle, after 2 decades of conversations with skeptics and atheists, the reasons I believe. This is the best person to write the book with all of the debates and discussions that he has hosted. Highly recommend you go and check it out. Justin, thank you so much for coming on. This was truly an honor. I really enjoyed this.
Oh, thank you so much. So good to be with you, and all the very best as you continue these conversations yourself.
Thank you. God bless. See y'all later. Everybody hit the like button and subscribe button too.
See ya.